Who are you waiting for? The question hit Ethan Callahan like a cold wind off the Montana plains, direct, unashamed, and impossible to ignore. He turned slowly, his jaw tightening beneath the gray stubble of a man who had stopped caring how he looked to the world. 7 years. 7 years he had sat on that same bench, holding that same folded letter, watching that same train disappear into nothing. And in all that time, not a single soul in Willow Creek had ever dared ask. Until her. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. The town of Willow Creek, Montana, had a particular kind of silence that settled in around 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoons. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of people who had learned over time to hold their breath for the same reason. Because that was when Ethan Callahan rode in. You could set a watch by it. His horse, a dark roan gelding named Corporal, would appear at the far end of Main Street at 14 minutes before the hour. The sound of iron shoes on packed dirt was as familiar as the church bell that rang 2 hours before it. Shop owners would glance up from their counters. Children playing near the feed store would pause mid-stride. Old women on their porches would exchange a look that said everything and nothing at once. He never varied the route, never stopped to speak. He tied Corporal to the post outside the station with the same knot, tight, efficient. The knot of a man who had learned that things left loose tended to disappear, and he walked through the station doors with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned against the cold, regardless of season. He bought a platform ticket from whoever happened to be behind the window. He sat on the third bench from the left on the platform side. He placed his hat on the empty space beside him, crown down brim, facing forward. And he waited. The westbound train arrived at exactly 3 o'clock. It slowed with a great groan of iron and steam. A handful of passengers stepped off. A handful more climbed aboard. The conductor called his "all aboard" to nobody in particular. And then the train pulled away, vanishing into the gray-green distance of the Montana hills. Ethan watched it go every time. He never boarded. He never spoke to the passengers. He never looked away until the last curl of smoke disappeared beyond the ridge. Then he stood, retrieved his hat, tucked something back inside his coat, with the careful deliberateness of a man returning a photograph to a frame, and he walked back through the station and untied Corporal and rode home. For 7 years, that was the whole of it. Thomas Reed, who had worked Ethan's ranch as foreman for going on 22 years, and who considered himself the closest thing to a friend the man possessed, had long since stopped trying to talk him out of it. He'd tried once in the second year on a February Sunday, when the temperature had dropped to dangerous, and Ethan had still ridden in with his collar up and his expression fixed. "You're going to kill yourself with this," Thomas had said, standing in the barn doorway, while Ethan saddled Corporal. "Mind the fence line on the north pasture," Ethan had replied. "2 posts need replacing before the ground freezes solid." That was the end of that conversation, and every conversation like it. The town talked naturally. Towns like Willow Creek were built on talk the way they were built on river water and good soil. It was simply what kept things alive. Some said Ethan was grieving. Some said he was punishing himself. The more dramatic among them said he was waiting for a ghost, which was not entirely wrong, though not in the way they meant it. What everyone agreed on was this: you did not ask Ethan Callahan about the train station. You did not ask him about Rose. You did not, if you valued the particular warmth of his occasional goodwill, press him on matters he had decided were closed. That was the consensus. Clara Whitmore had not received the memo. She arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day that held particular significance in Willow Creek, but which would later feel like it should have. The morning train from Billings deposited her on that same platform with a single trunk, a leather satchel worn soft from years of use, and the expression of someone who had already done their grieving and arrived at the practical, quiet side of it. She was 31 years old, though she carried herself with the self-possession of someone who had lived considerably more than that in terms of what life had asked of her. Her hair was the color of winter wheat pulled back with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that she was not the kind of person who had time to fuss. Her eyes were gray, not the flat gray of overcast sky, but the particular gray of water running over stone, which is to say, They had depth and movement, and a quality of seeing things that weren't entirely on the surface. She had come to Willow Creek to work. The station master, a round-faced man named Gerald Purcell, who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and had the disposition of someone who considered any change in routine a personal affront, showed her the clerk's window and the ledger system and the schedule board with the air of a man transferring ownership of something he'd rather keep. "Previous clerk left in October," he said. "Family situation." "I understand," Clara said. "You'll handle ticketing, schedule posting, lost luggage inquiries, and passenger assistance. Telegrams go through the line on the east wall. You don't touch the safe." "I understand," Clara said again. Gerald seemed mildly unsettled by her equanimity. He'd expected at least one question about the living quarters behind the station, or the salary discrepancy she had presumably noticed in the contract. He'd prepared explanations for both. Clara offered him neither the questions nor the opportunity for the explanations. She simply tied on the clerk's apron, opened the ledger to the current page, and said, "What time does the first train arrive?" Gerald told her. And that was more or less how Clara Whitmore came to Willow Creek. She noticed Ethan on her second Sunday. The first Sunday she had been occupied with a ticketing confusion involving two families with nearly identical surnames who had both booked passage on the same car, and by the time the platform cleared, she had missed the particular stillness that settled around the man on the third bench. But the second Sunday she had no such distraction. She was organizing the schedule board when she heard the horse outside. The rhythm of it was different from the usual midday traffic. Deliberate, unhurried, the gait of a horse that knew exactly where it was going and had no intention of being rushed. She glanced through the window without thinking about it. She saw him tie the horse, watched the knot, noted the economy of the movement, not careless, not hurried, but reduced to its essential components in the way that only habit could produce. He came through the door. How was a large man, not tall in the theatrical sense, but substantial in the way that certain trees were substantial, the kind of width and solidity that suggested roots rather than height. His face was the face of the Montana landscape itself, weathered, spare, capable of great beauty in the right light, and deeply indifferent to whether or not that light was currently available. He approached the window. Clara met his eyes for a fraction of a second. Gray-blue like early morning before the color decided what it was going to be. She had a brief, inexplicable impression of something vast and very still, like standing at the edge of a field just before a storm. "Platform ticket," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had long ago stopped using words he didn't need. "Name?" Clara asked, because she was new and she was doing things properly. Something shifted in his face. Not annoyance exactly, more like the mild surprise of a man encountering a door where there had previously been open air. "Callahan," he said. "Ethan Callahan." She wrote it in the ledger. She slid the ticket across the counter. He took it without looking at her again and walked through the platform door. Clara stood at the window and watched him sit down on the third bench. Watched him place his hat beside him with that particular careful gesture, crown down, as though the space beside him was occupied. Watched him reach inside his coat and withdraw a folded piece of paper which he held flat against his knee without opening. She watched the train arrive. She watched him watch it. She watched him not move. She watched the train leave. She watched him stand, replace the letter, pick up his hat, and go. Gerald appeared at her shoulder with a fresh cup of coffee he hadn't offered her. "That's Callahan," he said in the tone of someone identifying a local landmark. "I know," Clara said. "He bought a ticket. Does it every week. Has since his wife died." Gerald sipped his coffee. 7 years, give or take. Clara said nothing, but she watched the dust of the roan gelding's hooves settle on the street outside the station long after Gerald had gone back to his office. The third Sunday she paid closer attention. She told herself it was professional curiosity. She was new to the town, and it was sensible to understand the regulars, their habits, their particular needs. She had worked at a station in Ohio before the family illness that had pulled her home, and she knew better than most that a train station was a place people came with feelings they didn't know how to carry anywhere else. You learned to read them after a while. She watched the way he arrived exactly 14 minutes early. Not 13, not 15. 14. She watched the way he bought his ticket without making eye contact, as though the transaction itself was a small, tolerable intrusion on something private. She watched the way he sat, not slumped, not rigid, but with the particular held quality of a man who had made a decision long ago and was committed to it regardless of cost. She watched the letter. He didn't open it. He never opened it. He simply held it flat against his knee, and sometimes his hand moved slightly, a small unconscious pressing of his palm against the paper, the way you might press your hand against a sore place that you couldn't stop touching. The fourth Sunday, Gerald was out with a head cold, and Clara worked the platform door herself. She handed Ethan his ticket directly, rather than sliding it under the window glass. Their fingers did not touch. But he looked up. "You're new," he said. "6 weeks," Clara said. "You were watching me last week." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who found facts more manageable than whatever the alternatives might be. "I watch everyone," Clara said honestly. "That's how I learn the regulars." He looked at her for a moment, that gray-blue early morning look that felt like weather moving in, and then he walked through to the platform without another word. But he sat differently that day. She noticed it from the window. His shoulders were angled perhaps 2 degrees toward the station door, rather than directly at the tracks. It was a subtle thing. The kind of thing only someone paying close attention would notice. Clara was paying close attention. The fifth Sunday brought rain. Not the gentle Montana drizzle that softened the prairie grass and made the cattle steam gently in the early morning, but a hard-driving October rain that came in sideways and turned the station platform into a river of brown water and sent the few waiting passengers huddling against the wall under the narrow overhang. Ethan came anyway. I was soaked through before he even reached the ticket window. His coat darkened from the shoulders down his hat, channeling water off the brim in a steady stream. He bought his ticket with the same words, the same economy, the same flat refusal to acknowledge that anything about this situation was remarkable. Clara watched him take his usual seat, watched him set his hat down beside him, watched him reach for the letter, and then for the first time pause. The rain was heavy enough that the letter would be destroyed in seconds if he took it out. His hand hovered at the inside pocket of his coat. Then he lowered it to his knee, empty, and sat with his hands flat against his legs and his face toward the tracks. Something about it was harder to look at than usual. The absence of the letter. The empty hands. It felt like watching a man realize that the one thing he'd been holding on to couldn't help him right now. Clara made a decision. She untied her apron, folded it over the back of her chair, and went to the door that led to the platform. The rain hit her immediately. She had not thought to bring an umbrella. She walked the length of the platform in the driving wet and sat down on the far edge of the third bench, not beside the hat, which was drowning on his left, but on his right, leaving the kind of respectful distance that said, "I am here, but I am not intruding." Ethan did not look at her. A long moment passed. The rain was very loud on the station roof above them. "You're going to ruin your dress," he said. "It'll dry," Clara said. Another moment. "You don't have to sit out here," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. The train was 4 minutes away. She could hear it, that low, faraway vibration in the rails that came before the sound. She had learned to feel it in her feet. She said, "I lost my family last year." He turned to look at her then, not with the mild alarm of someone confronted with unexpected personal information, but with the careful attention of a man who understood that some sentences required witness. "Fever," she said. "My mother, my younger sister, within 2 weeks of each other." She kept her eyes on the tracks. "I stayed in our house for a long time after. I kept setting the table for 3. Ethan said nothing. "It wasn't grief exactly," she continued. "It was more like I'd forgotten how to stop doing the things I did for them. The habits were still there, even when the people weren't." The train appeared at the far edge of the valley. "Is that what it is?" she asked quietly. "Habit." The rain drummed on. Ethan reached inside his coat. His hand was steadier than she expected. He took out the letter. He held it for a moment in the rain, not opening it, just holding it, The way you hold something to show someone you have it, not to read it aloud. Her name was Rose, he said. The train came in. The steam and the noise of it rose around them, and the platform shook under their feet, and the conductor called, and the passengers moved. And through all of it, Ethan Callahan sat still on his bench, with a wet letter in his hands, and Clara Whitmore sat beside him, and did not look away. When the train left, the silence it took with it felt different from before. "She used to wave from the window," Ethan said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Every time she came back from her father's place, she'd find the window of her car, and she'd wave before the train even stopped. Said she could always see me first." Clara listened. "I stood right there." He gestured at a point on the platform 10 feet ahead of them. "Same spot every time. She knew exactly where to look." "How long were you married?" Clara asked. 14 years. He folded the letter back slowly along its existing creases. "She died in January, the winter of '82. Fever came on fast." A pause. "Wasn't unlike what you described." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I kept coming back because—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "The last time I saw her was on this platform. She was leaving for her father's, who was sick. She waved from that third window back from the engine. I stood right there, and I watched her go, and I thought, I'll see her Sunday." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "She never came back," Clara said, not as a question. "She died at her father's house, couldn't travel home." He looked at the empty tracks. "So I come back instead." Clara was quiet for a moment. The rain was letting up slightly, tapering from a roar to a steady murmur. "You come back so she doesn't have to do it alone," Clara said. "The leaving." Ethan looked at her sharply. It was the look of a man who had just heard something articulated that had lived inside him for 7 years without ever finding words. "I hadn't thought of it that way," he said. "That's what it looks like from the outside," Clara said quietly. "Like you're keeping her company in the only moment you still have access to." A long silence. Then, with a carefulness that felt like he was picking up something fragile. "Nobody ever said anything like that to me before." "Nobody ever sat in the rain with you before," Clara said, and for the first time in what Thomas Reed would later describe as longer than I care to count, Ethan Callahan almost smiled. She didn't push after that. That was the thing about Clara that Ethan would later try to explain to Thomas and fail because it required language he didn't normally use. She had asked the one question and received the one answer, and then she had simply remained. Not pressed, not probed, not offered the particular brand of brisk sympathy that amounted to being told to move on in a polite voice. She had just sat beside him in the rain until the platform dried and then gone back inside to her ledger and her schedule board as though nothing unusual had happened. The following Sunday she brought 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the bench beside him without comment and went back inside. He drank it. The Sunday after that, she came out again when the platform cleared and sat at the far end of the bench, the same respectful distance, and he told her a small thing about Rose unprompted. How she had been a remarkable hand with the ranch accounts. How she had kept 3 sets of ledgers and could find an error in any of them blindfolded. "Sounds like someone else I know," Ethan said, and looked sideways at her with that gray-blue look, and this time it was Clara who almost smiled. The Sunday after that, Thomas Reed happened to be riding through town and pulled up outside the station just as Ethan was walking back to his horse, and he saw the way Ethan's shoulders sat looser somehow than they had in years, and he stood very still in the street and watched his oldest friend ride away with the careful attention of a man who suspects something important has shifted and is not yet sure whether to be grateful or afraid. He was both, as it turned out. But that comes later. What came first was the morning. Thomas showed up at the station on a Tuesday, not Sunday, not a train day in any significant sense, and found Clara at her window and introduced himself with the bluntness of a man who had spent decades around cattle and had concluded that the most efficient approach to any situation was the direct one. "Thomas Reed," he said. "I work for Callahan." "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I work here. I know who you are." He set his elbows on the counter. He was 60 years old and built like a fence post, angular, weather-beaten, completely unmoved by the passage of time in any aesthetic sense. His eyes were the sharp assessing eyes of a man who had spent his life reading weather and animals, and when necessary people. "What are your intentions with him?" Clara looked at him for a moment, with the particular measured patience of a woman who had been underestimated before and knew how to wait it out. "My intentions," she said carefully, "are to do my job and drink my coffee, and occasionally keep a lonely man company on a Sunday afternoon. That's the complete inventory." Thomas studied her. "He hasn't talked about Rose in 7 years, he said. "He talked to me," Clara said. "I know." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's why I'm here." Something passed across his face that was not quite concern and not quite hope, but occupied the complicated territory between them. "He's a good man," Thomas said. "He's been carrying something too heavy for one person for a very long time. If you're going to sit with him on that bench, I need to know you're not going to—" He stopped, started again. "I've watched that man be careful with every living thing on his ranch. His horses, his cattle, his people. He's careful because he's already lost what he wasn't careful enough to hold." He looked at her directly. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "Then I'll leave it there," Thomas said. He pushed back from the counter. At the door he stopped and turned. "For what it's worth," he said, "she would have liked you. Rose would have liked you considerable." He left before Clara could respond. She stood at her window for a long moment after watching him ride away in the same direction Ethan always rode. Then she turned back to her ledger and found the line where she'd been and kept working. But her hand wasn't quite steady. The next Sunday, Ethan arrived at his usual time and bought his usual ticket and sat on his usual bench. Clara came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat at her usual distance, and they watched the usual train arrive and depart. Then Ethan said without preamble, "Thomas came to see you." Clara considered denying it for approximately 1 second. "He did." "What did he say?" "He asked about my intentions. And I told him they were entirely respectable." She sipped her coffee. "He told me Rose would have liked me." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She would have," he said. "She liked people who said what they meant." I gathered that was a compliment from Thomas. It's the highest compliment he knows how to give. Ethan turned the coffee cup in his hands. "He's been worried about me." I noticed. "Have you been worried about me?" He said it with the careful sideways quality of a man asking something he doesn't entirely mean to ask aloud. Clara thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way he is." She looked out at the tracks. "He's worried you're stuck. I'm not sure you're stuck. I think you know exactly what you're doing, and you've just decided it's worth doing." Ethan looked at her. And I think you deserve to decide that." She met his eyes. "I just wonder sometime if you've considered whether she'd agree with you." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice had changed in some way that was difficult to name. Quieter, perhaps, but with more weight in it, the way water gets heavier as it goes deeper. "She told me once," he said, "that she'd haunt me proper if I spent my life grieving instead of living." He stared at the empty tracks. "She was specific about it, said she'd rattle pots and scare the horses." Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her unguarded, the kind that changes the temperature of a conversation. Ethan looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face shifted in a way that was too quick to catch, directly like a bird landing and lifting in the same moment. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said when she'd recovered. "She was," Ethan said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she also said I was the worst person she'd ever met at accepting help from anyone. Was she right? Probably. He stood up, retrieving his hat. He looked down at Clara, still sitting on the bench, looked at her with that considering early morning sky look. "Same time next week," he said. It was not a question about the train schedule. Clara held his gaze. "I'll bring the coffee," she said. Ethan Callahan walked off the platform for the first time in 7 years without once looking back at the tracks. In his coat pocket. The letter was exactly where it had always been. but for the first time its weight felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just carried differently. The way you learn over years to carry the things you cannot put down. He rode home through the late afternoon gold of the Montana hills, and Thomas Reed was waiting in the yard with a look on his face that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing completely. "Well," Thomas said. Ethan dismounted and handed him the reins. "Fence line on the north pasture," Ethan said. Thomas blinked. "What about it?" "You fixed it last spring," Ethan said. It held. He walked toward the house. Thomas stood in the yard holding Corporal's reins, watching him go with an expression that a man his age and his particular variety of reserve would never describe as moved. He was moved anyway. He stood there long enough that Corporal turned and looked at him with the patient, mild reproach of a horse who wanted his grain, and that finally broke it. "Yeah, all right," Thomas said quietly to nobody in particular. "Yeah." He led the horse to the barn, and in the big ranch house at the edge of the Willow Creek Valley, Ethan Callahan sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the folded letter in front of him. And he did not open it. He never opened it anymore. Hadn't opened it in years. Didn't need to because he knew every word, but he pressed his palm flat against it the way he always did. And then for the first time in 7 years, he closed his eyes and sat in the quiet of the house without fighting it. The clock on the mantel ticked. The wind moved through the eaves. Somewhere in the back of the house, a pipe shifted and settled, and Ethan Callahan sat still in the middle of all of it and let himself breathe. The Monday after the Sunday when Ethan walked off the platform without looking back at the tracks, Thomas Reed showed up at breakfast with the look of a man who had spent the night turning something over in his mind and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He poured himself coffee. He sat down across from Ethan. He looked at the table for a moment, the way a man looks at a card he's about to play. "You going to tell me what's different?" Thomas said. "Or are you going to make me ask?" Ethan cut into his biscuit. "Nothing's different." "You slept," Thomas said. "I heard it. Or rather, I didn't hear you up at 2 in the morning walking the floorboards, which amounts to the same thing." Ethan chewed. Said nothing. 7 years of 2 a.m. walking, Thomas said. And last night quiet. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "That clerk have anything to do with it?" "Her name is Clara," Ethan said. Thomas went very still in the particular way of a man who has just received more information than he expected from a single sentence. Because Ethan Callahan in 7 years had not once referred to anyone at that train station by their given name. "Clara," Thomas repeated carefully. "She lost her family last year," Ethan said. "Her mother and her sister, fever." He looked up from his plate. She understood what it was to keep setting the table for people who weren't there anymore. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "And you told her about Rose?" "Some of it." "How much of it?" Ethan met his eyes. "Enough." Thomas nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the yard where 2 of the ranch hands were already moving toward the barn in the cold morning air. "You know what Rose would say," Thomas said finally. "I know exactly what she'd say," Ethan said. "She said it to me before she ever needed to. She was specific about it." "Pots rattling," Thomas said. "And the horses." Thomas almost smiled. It was the almost smile of a man who had loved the woman being referenced and was grateful that her memory could still be spoken aloud, without the conversation collapsing under its own weight. "She was specific," Thomas agreed. They finished breakfast without another word on the subject. But when Ethan rode out to check the north pasture that morning, Thomas stood in the yard and watched him go with an expression that had quietly over the course of 1 cup of coffee reorganized itself from worry into something more careful and more hopeful and considerably more afraid, because hope at a certain age felt more dangerous than the alternative. He went back inside and washed the breakfast dishes. It was the closest Thomas Reed came to prayer. Clara, for her part, told nobody anything. She was not by nature a private person. She was in fact the kind of person who understood instinctively that connection required disclosure, that you could not sit beside someone in the rain and tell them about your dead mother and your dead sister and expect the walls to go back up afterward, but she was careful about what she offered to whom and when. Gerald Purcell was not a whom. Gerald Purcell was a station master who communicated primarily through disapproval of anything that had happened after 1875, and who would have transformed a conversation about Ethan Callahan into town gossip within 48 hours. So when Gerald said, as he inevitably did on the Monday after that fourth Sunday, "Noticed you sitting on the platform again yesterday?" Clara said simply, "I thought the fresh air would do me good." And Gerald said, in the tone of a man who did not believe her and had filed the non-belief away for future reference. What Clara did instead was write a letter. She wrote it to her friend Margaret, who lived in Billings, and who was the person Clara trusted most in the world, with the complicated inside workings of her own feelings. Margaret was a practical woman who had been married for 30 years, and who gave advice the way a good doctor gave medicine in the right amount at the right time, without sugarcoating. "There is a man here," Clara wrote, "who has been doing something for 7 years that I keep thinking about. He comes to the train station every Sunday and sits on a bench and watches the westbound train arrive and leave, and then goes home. He lost his wife 7 years ago, and the last time he saw her was on that platform. I sat with him last Sunday in the rain, and he told me her name." She paused, pen hovering. "I don't know what to do with the way I feel about it. Not about him. Margaret, not yet. Maybe not at all. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about the particular feeling of being the first person in 7 years that someone trusted with the most important thing they carry. It feels like being handed something irreplaceable and being told to hold it carefully. I am trying very hard to hold it carefully." She sealed the letter and posted it the next morning. 3 days later, Margaret's reply arrived. "You've always been good at holding things carefully," Margaret wrote. "The question is whether you're allowed to set anything down eventually, or whether you'll just stand there being careful forever. Don't be so careful that you forget to be present. The man sounds like someone worth being present for. Just be honest. You're always better when you're honest." Clara read it twice at her desk behind the ticket window. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to her schedule board. She was still thinking about it when Ethan arrived the following Sunday. He came earlier than usual. Not drastically, perhaps 5 minutes, but enough that Clara noticed it and understood what it meant without requiring him to explain it. A man who had been doing the same thing for 7 years to the minute did not arrive 5 minutes early by accident. She had the coffee ready. She came out to the platform before he had fully settled onto the bench, and she handed him his cup, and she sat closer this time, not dramatically, but measurably, and he didn't comment on it. "I've been thinking," he said, which was how he tended to begin things that mattered. "About?" Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "What you said, about keeping her company in the only moment I still have access to." He looked at his coffee. "I've been thinking that you might be right about that, and thinking about whether it's helping or whether it's—" He stopped. Tried again. "Whether I've been using the grief as a way to stay close to her, and whether that's different from actually grieving." Clara considered this carefully. "What do you think?" "I think I learned a long time ago that as long as I kept coming back here, I didn't have to figure out who I was without her." He said it the way a person says a thing they've known for a while, but never said aloud, with the flatness of confirmed truth rather than the surprise of new discovery. "Thomas would tell you I've been stubborn about it." "Thomas told me you were the worst person he knew at accepting help," Clara said. Ethan looked at her sideways. "He told you that directly. He told me Rose told him that." Something moved through Ethan's face. Not grief exactly, more like the particular tenderness of encountering someone you love in a place you didn't expect them. "She told everyone that," he said. "It was practically her opening line when she introduced me." His voice shifted, took on a different cadence. Warmer, slightly higher, unmistakably, an impression of someone deeply remembered. "This is Ethan. He's the finest man I've ever known, and he will die before he asks anyone to hand him something he can reach himself." Clara laughed, and the laugh startled a pair of sparrows off the station roof. "She sounds like she kept you honest," Clara said. "Constantly," Ethan said, "without ever once making me feel ashamed of what she was honest about." He was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to do than people appreciate. Yes, Clara said. It is. He glanced at her. You know that from experience. I know it from having done it badly, Clara said, and having had it done well for me, and understanding the difference. The train was still 20 minutes away. The platform was empty. The morning had that particular held quality of late autumn in Montana. Cold enough to see your breath, clear enough to see for miles, the kind of day that felt simultaneously like an ending and a beginning. Tell me about your family, Ethan said. If you want. Clara looked at the tracks for a moment. My mother's name was Helen, she said. She was the most competent person I've ever known. She could do 3 things at once and make each one look effortless. When she got sick, it was the first time in my life I ever saw her ask for a glass of water instead of getting up to get it herself. She paused. My sister Ruth was 24. She wanted to be a school teacher. She had a particular way of explaining things. She could make you feel like you'd understood something difficult, not because she'd simplified it, but because she'd found the exact right angle to show it to you. Ethan listened the way he did everything, with complete focused stillness. They died within 2 weeks of each other, Clara said. Mother first, then Ruth. She kept her voice even, but it cost something. I stayed in the house for 4 months after. I kept their rooms the way they'd left them. I kept buying the things they liked at the market. I'd come home with Ruth's particular brand of tea and stand in the kitchen holding it and not quite understand why I'd done it. The habits stay, Ethan said quietly. The habits stay, Clara agreed. And then one morning I got up and I understood that the kindest thing I could do for myself was to go somewhere that didn't already know the shape of what I'd lost. So I came here. A silence. Do you regret it? Ethan asked. Coming here. Clara looked at him steadily. No, she said. Not even a little. The train came in on schedule. They sat through its arrival and departure the way they had developed the habit of sitting through it side by side, unhurried present. And when the last sound of it faded, Ethan said, "Same time next week," with the same inflection as before, and Clara said, "I'll bring the coffee," with the same answer, and they parted. But this time, Ethan said as he stood at the platform door, "I'd like to hear more about Ruth sometime, the school teacher who found the right angle." Clara nodded. He went. She stood on the platform for a moment after, and she thought about Margaret's letter. Don't be so careful that you forget to be present. She was present. She could feel it in the way that Sunday afternoons had started to carry more weight than any other part of the week, that she thought was either very good or very complicated. She strongly suspected it was both. The Tuesday that changed everything started like every other Tuesday. Clara opened the station at 6:30. She posted the morning schedule. She handled 2 ticketing complaints, 1 lost luggage inquiry, and a lengthy dispute between Gerald Purcell and a freight conductor over a bill of lading that had nothing to do with her, and that she resolved anyway, because Gerald's approach to conflict resolution was to become incrementally more rigid until the other party simply gave up, which was not a functional strategy. At 10 o'clock, a man she didn't recognize came to her window. He was well-dressed in the way that certain men were well-dressed, not for warmth or practicality, but for the impression it made on others. His suit was too fine for Willow Creek. His hat was too clean. He had the soft hands and the watchful eyes of a man who did his work with words rather than with anything requiring physical effort. "I'm looking for information about land titles in this territory," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. The voice of someone who had learned to lead with pleasantness because it made the rest easier. Specifically in the valley east of here, the Callahan grazing land. Clara kept her face neutral with the ease of long practice. "This is a train station," she said. "Land title records are held at the territorial office in Billings." "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I was just hoping someone local might know about any disputes, or any financial difficulties the current owner might be experiencing." He set a card on the counter. "Wesley Harlan, land acquisition, out of Helena." Clara looked at the card. She did not pick it up. "I wouldn't know about private financial matters," she said. "Naturally." He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes by a considerable distance. If you happen to hear anything, I'd appreciate a word. I'm staying at the Willow Creek Hotel for the week." He tapped the card. There'd be something in it for anyone who pointed me in the right direction. He left. Clara waited until the door closed behind him. Then she picked up the card, looked at it for a long moment, and put it in her apron pocket next to Margaret's letter. She didn't tell Ethan on Sunday. Not because she was hiding it, she didn't hide things as a general principle, but because she didn't yet know what she was looking at. She had learned in the course of a life that had required her to be careful with resources of every kind. That information deployed too early was often information wasted. She wanted to understand what Wesley Harlan was actually doing before she said anything that might cause Ethan to do something precipitous. What she did instead was start paying attention in a different way. She heard things at the ticket window. This was simply the nature of the job. People waiting for trains talked, and people talked most freely in the presence of someone whose job required them to listen, and whose social position was adjacent, but not central. Clara was good at the particular stillness that encouraged people to say more than they meant to. Over the following week, she heard 3 things that mattered. The first was that the early winter had hit the valley ranches harder than expected. 2 ranchers had already sold parcels to cover their losses. The feed prices had gone up, and the cattle prices had gone down in the same month, which was the kind of convergence that broke operations that had survived decades. The second was that Ethan Callahan's north pasture had taken significant damage from an early ice storm. A fact delivered by 2 ranch hands, talking at the far end of the platform, neither of whom knew she was listening. The third was Wesley Harlan's name spoken by the bank manager's wife in the context of a conversation with her friend that Clara was not supposed to overhear. "Wesley Harlan's been in twice this week," the bank manager's wife said, asking Harold about liens and mortgages on the valley properties. Harold told him he shouldn't be discussing that, and Harlan just smiled and said he was merely planning ahead. Clara processed all 3 pieces of information. She thought about the man with the clean hands and the watchful eyes. She thought about Ethan's north pasture. She thought about 7 years of Sunday afternoons, and a man who was only just beginning slowly, painfully, to look up from the tracks. She made a decision. The next morning, before the station opened, she went to the Territorial Records Office, which was a small room attached to the back of the county clerk's office, and which contained, among other things, the filed copies of land grants and grazing agreements for the Willow Creek Valley going back to the original territorial surveys. The clerk there, a young man named Paul, who was perpetually bewildered by his own filing system, looked up when she came in. "I need to look at the original land grant records for the valley properties east of town," Clara said, "specifically the Callahan holdings." Paul blinked. "You're the station clerk." "I am also a citizen of this territory who has the right to examine public records," Clara said pleasantly. "Which these are." Paul, who had not been trained for pushback and was not temperamentally suited to it, showed her to the relevant cabinet. Clara spent 2 hours with the documents. What she found was not immediately alarming. But it was the kind of not immediately alarming thing that a person with experience in railway records, which involved large amounts of money, complicated land agreements, and the particular creativity of men who wanted what other people had recognized as potentially very alarming indeed. The original Callahan land grant filed in 1871 contained a clause. It was buried in the 3rd page of the original survey document, written in the dense legal language of the territorial period, and it concerned what happened to the grazing rights on the east section of the property, in the event that the primary structure, the ranch house, was ever vacated for a period of more than 18 months. In that event, the grazing rights reverted to a secondary claimant. The secondary claimant was listed as a landholding company. The landholding company, when Clara traced it through 3 other documents, with the methodical patience of someone who had once spent 6 months straightening out a railway's financial records, turned out to be currently registered to a principal named Wesley Harlan. Clara sat very still with the document in her hands. The clause had existed for 18 years without ever being triggered because the Callahan ranch house had never been vacated. Even in the worst years of Ethan's grief, he had lived there. Thomas Reed had lived there. The property had been continuously occupied. But the east section, the north pasture, the one the ice storm had damaged, contained one of the outbuildings. An old bunkhouse that had been sitting empty for 3 years since Ethan had consolidated his ranch hands to the main bunkhouse closer to the house. It was not the primary structure, but the document's language was not precise. A clever lawyer, and Clara suspected that Wesley Harlan employed clever lawyers, might argue that the clause applied to any significant structure on the east section. It was probably not a winning legal argument, but it was an argument, and arguments cost money to fight. And men under financial pressure from a bad winter sometimes couldn't afford to fight arguments, even losing ones. Clara put the documents back in exact order. She thanked Paul, who was still bewildered, and walked back to the station in the cold morning air. She was thinking about something Thomas Reed had said on his one visit to her window. He's been carrying something too heavy for one person for a very long time. He had meant the grief, but it applied, she thought, more broadly than that. She arrived at the station and hung up her coat and tied on her apron and opened the window for the morning passengers. And all day she was exactly as efficient and pleasant as she always was. But in the back of her mind, behind everything else, she was turning over what she'd found and thinking about the man with the watchful eyes who was staying at the Willow Creek Hotel and who had offered something in it for anyone who pointed him in the right direction. She was thinking about how Ethan, who was the worst person Thomas Reed knew at accepting help, had spent 7 years managing alone things that required more than one person. She was thinking that the world very often arranged for the kind of people who refused help to need it at the precise moment when refusing it was most dangerous. And she was thinking that she had not come to Willow Creek to stand behind a window and let things happen that she could see coming and didn't have to let happen. Sunday was 4 days away. She had 4 days to decide exactly what she was going to say, and how, and in which order. On Thursday, Harlan came back to the station window. He was as pleasant as before. He bought a ticket to Billings for the following Tuesday, a return ticket, she noted, which meant he intended to come back. He set his card on the counter again, though she hadn't removed the first one from her pocket. "You think about whether you'd heard anything," he said. "I have a good memory," Clara said. "I recall you saying something like that." He leaned on the counter slightly. Comfortable. Confident in the way of men who had been comfortable so long they'd forgotten what discomfort felt like. The Callahan situation, you understand, there's nothing adversarial about it. It's just business. The man's having a hard year, and there are arrangements that might benefit everyone. "What kind of arrangements?" Clara asked. He smiled. "A fair purchase. Cash. He keeps the house the main pasture. He just relinquishes the east section, which he's barely using anyway." The smile stayed in place with the fixed quality of something that had been practiced in a mirror. "It's a generous offer. A man in his position would be wise to take it before the situation complicates." "Before the situation complicates," Clara repeated. "Things can get legally untidy when old documents get involved," Harlan said pleasantly. "Easier for everyone when it's resolved simply." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I'll be sure to let you know if I hear anything useful," she said. He nodded. He picked up his ticket. He left. Clara watched him go. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out both cards, the first one from Tuesday and the new one he'd just placed on the counter, and she held them in her hand and thought about legally untidy and old documents and the particular way his voice had shifted barely perceptibly when he'd said the east section. He knew about the clause. He was counting on Ethan not knowing about it. And he was creating pressure, the hard winter, the financial strain, the vague threat of legal complication designed to push a proud man who didn't ask for help into accepting a bad deal because it felt like the only exit from a closing room. Clara put both cards on the desk behind her window face down, like playing cards she wasn't ready to show. She had 3 days until Sunday. She spent all 3 of them reading. Every railway agreement she'd ever processed had taught her one thing. Above everything else, the language that protected you was always already there. You just had to find it. The people who wrote these documents, the original territorial surveyors, the land grant officials, they weren't careless men. They had anticipated disputes. They had built protections into the original agreements precisely because they understood that the value of land attracted the kind of men who were very good at finding angles. On Saturday night, Clara sat in her small room behind the station with 3 pages of notes in her careful handwriting and the originals of 2 documents she had legally copied from the territorial records. She had found what she was looking for, buried 6 pages into the original Callahan Land Grant Survey, not on page 3, where the problematic clause lived, but on page 6, in a supplementary addendum, filed 2 years after the original grant, was a notation. She was confident Wesley Harlan's lawyers had either missed or were hoping nobody else would find. The addendum clarified the definition of primary structure for the purposes of the original grant. It was specific. It was unambiguous. And it made the clause on page 3 inapplicable to any outbuilding secondary structure or seasonal facility constructed after the date of the original grant. The old bunkhouse had been built in 1879, 8 years after the original grant. The east section was Ethan's, completely, legally, with no angle available that a territorial court would entertain for more than 10 minutes. Clara set down her pen. She looked at her notes. She thought about a man who had spent 7 years on a bench keeping company with a grief so heavy it had bent him nearly in half, who had finally slowly, painfully begun to straighten, who had started arriving 5 minutes early to a train station, because there was a person there he wanted to talk to who had told her about Rose's laugh and Rose's ledger books and the particular timbre of her voice, who had walked off a platform without looking back at the tracks. She thought about what it would do to that careful, just beginning straightening if a man like Wesley Harlan managed to strip away a piece of what Ethan had spent his life building. Clara put her notes in her leather satchel. She would tell him Sunday, all of it, and then she would hand him the documents and let him decide what to do next, because the one thing Thomas Reed had made absolutely clear was that Ethan Callahan could not be managed or maneuvered or protected without his knowledge. He had to be handed the truth directly, the way you handed a man something he needed both hands to hold. She owed him that. She blew out the lamp. In the dark of the small room behind Willow Creek's train station, Clara Whitmore lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind work along the eaves and the distant sound of the tracks settling in the cold, and she thought about all the ways that a person could arrive somewhere expecting one thing and find something else entirely, and how sometimes, not always, but sometimes the something else was better than anything you'd thought to hope for. She didn't know yet what this was. She only knew that Sunday was tomorrow, and that she had stopped somewhere between the rain and the documents and the cards, face down on her desk, being particularly careful about what she was feeling. She was present. That was enough for now. She told him on Sunday. Not immediately. Not before the coffee, not before the train, not before the particular quiet of the platform had settled around them, the way it always did. The comfortable earned quiet of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill silence with noise. Clara had learned over the past weeks that Ethan received information better when he wasn't braced for it. You didn't walk up to a man like Ethan Callahan with your arms full of something difficult and expect him to catch it cleanly. You had to set it down in front of him, step back, and let him come to it. So she waited until the train had come and gone. She waited until he'd finished his coffee and set the cup down on the bench between them with the small, satisfied click that meant he was settled, present, not going anywhere immediately. Then she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Ethan looked at her. Something in his face changed. Not alarm exactly, more like the particular attention of a man who had learned that certain openings led somewhere significant. He set both hands flat on his knees. "All right," he said. She told him about Harlan. The first visit. The second visit, the card on the counter, and the offer of something in it for anyone who pointed him in the right direction. She told him about the Territorial Records Office, and Paul, and the 2 hours with the documents. She told him about the clause on page 3, and what it said, and what Harlan was clearly planning to do with it. Ethan's jaw tightened during the clause. His hands pressed harder against his knees. She kept going. She told him about the addendum on page 6. She told him exactly what it said, and exactly why it made the clause inapplicable. She opened her leather satchel and took out the documents, the copies properly noted and dated, and laid them on the bench between them. Then she stopped talking. Ethan looked at the documents for a long moment. He didn't touch them. He stared at them the way you stare at something you need to let your eyes adjust to before you trust what you're seeing. He came to you, Ethan said. Twice. He thought you might. He stopped. Something moved through his face that was controlled with visible effort. He thought a station clerk might tell him what he wanted to know about my affairs. He was offering money, Clara said. He's done his arithmetic about who in this town might be persuaded. And he was wrong about you. Considerably, Clara said. Ethan picked up the first document. He read slowly with the thoroughness of a man who had spent decades reading contracts and agreements and knew that the words that mattered were never the obvious ones. Clara watched his eyes move down the page, watched them stop at the clause, watched his expression go through something she couldn't fully name. Recognition, anger, a cold, clear-eyed assessment. He put it down, picked up the second one, read to the addendum on page 6. He stopped. He read it again. He set the document down with a deliberateness that was very controlled. It's unambiguous, he said. Completely, Clara said. A territorial court would dismiss his claim in the first session. But he's counting on you not knowing about the addendum. He'll make the clause sound worse than it is, apply pressure through the winter financial strain, and offer you a purchase price that looks like relief instead of robbery. How bad is the winter situation? Ethan said, and it was not quite a question. Clara looked at him directly. I heard your ranch hands talking on the platform. I know about the north pasture. I'm not going to pretend I don't. He absorbed this. You've been paying attention. It's what I do, she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, the east section is the best grazing land I own. It's where Rose used to ride in the mornings. She called it her 400 acres of perfect. His voice had gone to a different register, still controlled, but carrying something beneath it. If Harlan had managed to get that land, Howe wasn't going to get it, Clara said firmly. It was never legally available to him. He was counting on complexity and pressure, and the fact that a proud man in a difficult year might not look closely enough at a document written 18 years ago. He was almost right, Ethan said quietly. Clara said nothing to that. Ethan stood up. He picked up both documents and held them for a moment, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not the loosening she'd been seeing over recent weeks, but something harder, older, the particular set of a man who had just identified a threat to something he would not relinquish. I need to take these to a lawyer, he said. Benjamin Cross in Billings, Clara said immediately. He handled the original territorial grants in this valley. He'll know these documents better than anyone. Ethan looked at her. The gray-blue look, direct and assessing, and carrying something that had no simple name. You already looked into that, he said. I did. When? Thursday evening, I sent a telegram. She met his eyes steadily. He's expecting you when you're ready. The silence lasted several seconds. Clara, Ethan said. Don't, she said. Don't thank me. Just go deal with it. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded once with the decisive quality of a man who had processed what needed processing and was now in motion. He walked off the platform. For the second week in a row, he didn't look back at the tracks. This time, he didn't look back at all. Thomas Reed's reaction when Ethan arrived home and laid the documents on the kitchen table and explained what they were and where they'd come from was to sit down very slowly in his chair. The way a man sits down when his legs have decided to handle something his face isn't ready to show yet. Wesley Harlan, Thomas said. You know him. I know of him. He worked a similar arrangement on the Bauer property 2 years ago outside of Helena. Old Heinrich Bauer didn't read the fine print and sold the east pasture for 1/3 of its value before anyone told him what he'd actually agreed to. Thomas looked at the documents. How did Clara find the addendum? She spent 2 hours in the Territorial Records office on a Tuesday morning before the station opened, Ethan said. Thomas was quiet. She sent a telegram to Benjamin Cross in Billings, Ethan continued, without being asked, because she'd already identified him as the right lawyer before I knew there was a problem to bring to a lawyer. Thomas looked up at him. She did that, Thomas said carefully, for you. She did that, Ethan said, Because it was the right thing to do and she was in a position to do it. He paused. But also for me. Yes. Thomas picked up the addendum copy. He read it with the same thoroughness Ethan had. He set it down. "We needs to be in Billings by Wednesday," Thomas said. "I'll ride out Tuesday morning." "I'm coming with you." Ethan looked at him. "Don't argue with me about this," Thomas said. "You are the worst person I have ever known at accepting help, and I have watched you be that person for 22 years, and I am going to Billings with you on Tuesday, and that is the complete conversation." Ethan looked at him for another moment. Then, "Fine." Thomas nodded. He looked back at the document. "Tell me something," he said. "When Harlan came to her window twice and offered her money for information about your situation, she could have used that. She didn't. She went the other direction entirely." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's not a small thing." "I know it isn't." Thomas set the document down. He looked at his oldest friend with the eyes of a man who had spent 60 years on this earth and learned to recognize the things that mattered when he saw them. "Rose picked good people," he said. "She always had a sense for it." He stood up from the table and reached for his coat. "I'll get the horses sorted for Tuesday." He was almost out of the kitchen when Ethan said, "Thomas." Thomas stopped. "She said Rose would have liked her," Ethan said. "You told her that." Thomas kept his back to the room for a moment. "I meant it," he said. He went out to the barn. Tuesday morning they rode for Billings. The meeting with Benjamin Cross took most of Wednesday. Cross was a spare, meticulous man of 65 who had been practicing territorial law since before Willow Creek had its own post office, and who had the particular manner of a man who had seen enough human dishonesty to be unsurprised by any specific instance of it, but who retained nonetheless a genuine personal outrage at the kind. He read both documents. He read them again. He asked 4 questions, each of them precise, and answered directly. Then he set the papers on his desk and looked at Ethan over his spectacles. "The addendum is dispositive," Cross said. "The secondary claimant provision applies only to the primary structure, as defined in the supplementary addendum, which explicitly excludes any structure built after the original survey date. The bunkhouse was built in 1879. The case doesn't exist." He paused. "However," Ethan waited. "However, a man like Harlan doesn't pursue something this long without having already filed preliminary paperwork. If he's filed a notice of claim with the territorial office, which I suspect he has or is about to, you'll need to respond formally to get it dismissed. That takes time and some expense." "How much time?" Thomas asked. 6 weeks if I file this week, 2 months if there are complications." "File this week," Ethan said. "There's something else." Cross folded his hands. "The woman who found this addendum, your station clerk." "Clara Whitmore," Ethan said. "She did very precise work." Cross tapped the copy. "The notation she found is real, properly dated, and exactly as applicable as she assessed. She also identified you as my client before contacting me, which suggests she knew this valley's legal history well enough to make that connection from a cold start." He looked at Ethan over his spectacles again. "Where did she work before Willow Creek?" "Ohio," Ethan said. "A railway station. She handled their records and accounts. Railway records are among the most legally complex documents in regular civilian use," Cross said. "If she's experienced with those, she has skills considerably beyond what a station clerk's salary would suggest." Ethan said nothing to that, but something moved through his expression that Cross, being a careful reader of people, noticed and did not comment on. "I'll file Wednesday afternoon," Cross said. "You'll hear from me within the fortnight." They shook hands. Ethan and Thomas rode back to Willow Creek through the cold and the dark, and they didn't talk much, the way men who have known each other for 22 years don't need to talk when the day has already said most of what needs saying. About an hour from home, Thomas said, "You're going to tell her how it went." "Of course," Ethan said. "I mean, you're going to tell her directly, not the way you tell me things, which is mostly by implication and the strategic use of silence. I am not that indirect. You told me about Rose on that bench by saying same time next week and waiting for me to understand the significance of you not looking back at the tracks," Thomas said. That is an extremely indirect man. Ethan considered this. I'll tell her directly. Good. Thomas pulled his collar up. And Ethan. What? Whatever else is happening with this woman, and I'm not saying what it is, I'm just saying it's something. Don't be so careful that you forget to be present. He paused. That's not my phrase, but it applies. Ethan looked at him sharply. Did you write to her friend in Billings? Thomas said nothing. Thomas. Margaret is a sensible woman, Thomas said with the dignity of a man who has been caught doing something he doesn't regret. You wrote to Clara's friend. We may have corresponded briefly on matters of mutual concern. He urged his horse forward slightly out of easy conversational range. Ethan stared at his foreman's retreating back for a moment. Then, in the dark and the cold of the Montana road, he laughed. It was a real laugh, not the almost smile, not the brief warming of the eyes, but an actual laugh that came from somewhere deeper than habit had been allowing things to come from. It surprised him. The sound of it surprised him. It surprised Thomas too. He pulled his horse up and turned to look. Ethan was still laughing. Thomas watched him for a moment. Then he turned back toward home and said nothing. But in the dark riding ahead, he was smiling in the way of a man who has waited a very long time for a particular sound and finally heard it. Clara heard about the Billings trip secondhand from Paul at the records office, who had heard from the bank manager's assistant, who had heard from someone who'd seen Ethan and Thomas ride through Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, she knew they'd gone to see Cross. By Thursday, she knew the meeting had happened. She didn't hear from Ethan directly until Sunday. Those 4 days had a particular quality. Not anxious exactly. Clara was not by temperament an anxious person, but alert. The way you're alert when you've set something in motion, and you know that what comes back will tell you something important, not just about the situation, but about the person at the center of it. She had told herself she was doing it because it was the right thing to do, which was true. She had also told herself that her involvement should end at the documents she had found. What needed finding? She had given him what he needed to fight it, and the rest was his affair, which was also true. What she had not been entirely honest with herself about was the feeling that had sat in her chest for the 4 days since Sunday, like something warm and slightly precarious. The feeling of a person who has handed someone something valuable and is waiting to find out if it was received the way it was offered. On Sunday morning, before she brought the coffee out, she stood at her window and watched him tie Corporal to the post. Watched the knot. Watched him come through the door. He looked different. Not dramatically. He was still the same man, same coat, same hat, same economy of movement. But there was something in the way he stood that was different. Less of that held quality, that constant managed containment. He looked like a man who had put something down and hadn't yet picked it back up, and was finding to his mild surprise that his hands felt lighter for it. He bought his ticket. He looked at her directly when he said thank you, which was new. On the platform, once she'd come out with the coffee, he said, Cross filed Wednesday afternoon. Harlan's preliminary claim, and he had filed one cross, was right. About that will be dismissed within 6 weeks. Good, Clara said. Harlan came to see me Thursday morning, Ethan said. Clara went very still. At the ranch. His voice was level. He brought a written purchase offer, cash above market rate for the East Section contingent on a quick decision. He drank his coffee. He was very smooth about it. Said he wanted to help a neighbor through a difficult winter. Said the legal situation with the old documents was complicated, and this would simplify everything considerably. What did you say? Clara asked. I told him I wasn't interested. Ethan paused. And then I told him I'd consulted with Benjamin Cross in Billings, who had reviewed the full grant documentation, including the supplementary addendum of 1873, and that any further approaches to my property or my employees or my associates would result in a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office. Clara absorbed this. How did he take that? He took it the way a man takes information he wasn't expecting, Ethan said, with a great deal of stillness followed by a very controlled exit. He set his coffee cup down. He didn't know about the addendum. No, Clara said. He was counting on nobody finding it. He was counting on a grieving rancher who doesn't ask for help not knowing he needed to look, Ethan said. He looked at her. He almost got that right. The train arrived. The steam and noise of it rose around them in the familiar way, the platform shaking gently under their feet, and they sat through it together as they always did. When the quiet returned, Ethan said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," Clara said. "In 14 years of marriage, Rose handled everything I was stubborn about by waiting until I'd figured out I needed the help, and then making sure it was available before I'd worked up the nerve to ask." He looked at the empty tracks. "She said once that the trick with me was to put the thing I needed somewhere I'd run into it naturally, so I didn't have to experience the dignity cost of asking directly." A pause. "I never thanked her properly for that. I meant to. I was going to. I had a whole life ahead of me to thank her in, and then I didn't." Clara waited. "You put the documents somewhere I'd run into them," he said. "You found the lawyer before I knew I needed one. You did it without making me feel the weight of the help, because you framed it as just what you did. Someone who paid attention and acted on what she saw." "That's what it was," Clara said. "It was more than that," Ethan said. Silence. "I know it was more than that," he said quietly. "And I don't know what to do with the gratitude for it, because every time I've tried to manage that feeling, it turns into something else, and I haven't decided yet whether to be honest about what that something else is." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You have time," she said. "Do I?" He met her eyes. There was something direct and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before. The look of a man who has stopped managing something and is simply standing in the middle of it. "Because I've been thinking about that. About time." He paused. "I wasted 7 years of it on that bench." "You didn't waste it," Clara said firmly. "You were honoring something real. That's not waste." "I was hiding," Ethan said. "I was using something real to do something that wasn't. I was using grief as a permission slip to stop living." He looked at his hands. "Rose would have been furious with me." "Pots and horses," Clara said. "Everyone," Ethan said. Another silence warmer than most. Then Clara said very carefully, "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you." Something shifted in his face. He went still in the way she recognized the complete focused stillness of a man bracing himself for information he doesn't want. "I received a letter," Clara said. 2 weeks ago. I didn't tell you because I was waiting to understand what I wanted to say about it, and I think I understand now." "A letter from where?" Ethan asked. "From a railway office in Denver," Clara said. "They're looking for an experienced clerk to manage their records department. The salary is 3 times what Gerald pays me. The work is exactly the kind of work I'm trained for." She met his eyes. "I haven't responded yet." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, "When did the offer come?" 14 days ago. He did the arithmetic. He understood what it meant that she'd received it before she went to the Territorial Records Office, before she'd spent her Thursday evenings with the documents, before she'd sent the telegram to Benjamin Cross. He understood that she had done all of those things while carrying that letter in her pocket. "You didn't leave," he said. "No," Clara said. "You could have. You had a reason." "I had an offer," Clara said. "That's different from a reason." He looked at her with that direct, unguarded look. "What is a reason?" he asked quietly. Clara held his gaze. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think I'm still finding out." The silence that followed was the longest one they'd ever shared. Not uncomfortable, not empty. The silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something large and deciding independently and simultaneously that they are not afraid of the size of it. Then Ethan said slowly, "The East Pasture. Rose used to ride out there in the mornings. She said the light came in at a particular angle on the east rise that she'd never seen anywhere else." He looked at the distance. "I haven't ridden out that way in 7 years." Clara waited. "I was thinking," he said, "that maybe it was time." "To go out there?" she asked. "To stop avoiding the things she loved, because I couldn't figure out how to love them without her." He looked at Clara. "She's been gone 7 years. I've been in the habit of avoiding things, so I wouldn't feel the absence." And lately I've been thinking that the absence is going to be there whether I avoid the things or not. So I might as well—" He stopped. Tried again. "I might as well ride east in the morning and see if the light still comes in that way." Clara said nothing for a moment. "It will," she said softly. "That kind of light doesn't go anywhere." Ethan nodded. He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked down at her still sitting on the bench with her empty coffee cup, her leather satchel, her steady gray eyes. "The Denver offer," he said. "When do you have to answer?" "I have another 2 weeks," Clara said. 2 weeks, he repeated. 2 weeks, she said. He held her gaze for one long, honest moment. Not asking anything directly. Not saying anything directly. Just standing in the middle of the something else he hadn't decided yet whether to be honest about, and letting her see that he was standing there. Then he put on his hat. "I'll see you Wednesday," he said. "Not Sunday, Wednesday. I need to ask Gerald if I can steal you away for a couple hours. I want to show you the east pasture before the ground freezes hard." Clara blinked. It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her. "All right," she said with the careful steadiness of someone whose heart has just done something without asking permission. He walked off the platform. This time, he walked differently. Not just without looking at the tracks, he walked like a man with somewhere specific to be, with a forward orientation that had been absent for 7 years. The walk of a person who has turned to face a direction they've been avoiding and found it more bearable than they expected. Clara sat on the bench for a long time after he'd gone. In her leather satchel, underneath the documents and the copies and the notes in her careful handwriting, was Denver's letter. She had not responded to it. She was beginning to understand with the particular clarity of a woman who had stopped being careful and started being present why that was. And in the warm and complicated center of that understanding was the knowledge that whatever came next was not yet decided, that 2 weeks was both a short time and a long one, depending on what happened in it, and that she who had come to Willow Creek looking for a place that didn't know the shape of what she'd lost had found instead something she hadn't known to look for. She picked up her empty coffee cup. She went back inside. The schedule board needed updating. The afternoon train was 40 minutes out. She had work to do. Gerald Purcell, to his credit, did not ask questions. When Ethan Callahan walked through the station doors on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock and stood at the ticket window and said, "I'd like to borrow your clerk for 2 hours, Gerald. I'll have her back before the noon train." Gerald looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent his life filing observations under headings he doesn't examine too closely and said, 2 hours. 2 hours, Ethan confirmed. Gerald looked at Clara, who was standing at the schedule board, with her back very deliberately to the conversation and her shoulders at the careful angle of someone not listening. Gerald looked back at Ethan. He sighed in the way of a man who recognizes that the world has decided to do something without consulting him. "Back by noon," Gerald said. That was all. Clara untied her apron with a composure she did not entirely feel, and hung it on its hook, and took her coat from the rack, and walked out through the station door into the cold November morning, without once looking at Gerald, because she was fairly certain that if she looked at Gerald, she would laugh, and laughing at Gerald was not something she could afford to do, and still expect to have a job in the afternoon. Ethan had 2 horses. Corporal, his usual roan, and a second mare. A steady, calm-tempered gray that he'd borrowed from Thomas, without explaining why. Because explaining why would have required a conversation he wasn't ready to have. And Thomas, to his enormous credit, had simply saddled the mare and handed over the reins and said nothing that wasn't about the horse. Clara looked at the gray mare. She looked at Ethan. "I grew up with horses," she said. "I thought you might have," he said. "You have the hands for it." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up with the ease of someone for whom this was old knowledge, and she saw something shift in Ethan's expression, a kind of quiet satisfaction. The look of a man whose instinct has been confirmed, and then they were moving out through Willow Creek's Main Street and east along the Valley Road, as the morning opened up around them, cold and clear and enormous, in the way that Montana mornings were enormous, as though the sky had decided to be as large as possible, just to make the point. They rode without talking for a while. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of 2 people who had discovered that they didn't need to fill the space between them, that the space itself was part of the conversation. After 20 minutes, Ethan said, "She rode this way every morning she was home. Said it was the best way to start a day. Said everything else made more sense after you'd seen the valley from the east rise." Clara listened. "I avoided it after she died," he said. "I avoided everything she'd particularly loved for a long time. I told myself it was because it was too painful. And it was. But it was also—" He paused. "It was also that I didn't know how to be a person who did those things alone. She was the one who taught me the value of them. Without her, they felt like artifacts, things that had belonged to a life that was finished." "And now?" Clara asked. I was quiet for a moment. "Now I think I've been looking at it wrong. I think those things she loved aren't artifacts. They're more like she had good taste. She recognized something real in them. That doesn't go away because she did." Clara considered this carefully. "You're giving yourself permission to inherit what she knew." Ethan turned to look at her in that direct way. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." They rode east. When they reached the rise, Ethan stopped his horse and Clara stopped beside him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the light was doing exactly what he had said it would do, coming in at an angle that was particular to this place and this hour, the kind of light that made you understand why someone would ride out every morning to see it. "She was right," Clara said quietly. "She usually was," Ethan said. He looked at the land spread below them, the east section, the 400 acres of perfect, the pasture that Wesley Harlan had tried to take, and failed, the ground that was his, and would remain his, and that he had not ridden out to see in 7 years. He looked at it with the expression of a man reclaiming something. "Thank you," he said. Not with the self-consciousness of a man who doesn't know how to thank people. He'd moved past that. He said it directly, looking at the land, and Clara understood it was for more than the documents and the lawyer and the telegram. It was for the bench in the rain, the 2 cups of coffee, the question nobody else had dared ask. "You already thanked me," she said. "Not for the right things," he said. She didn't argue with that. They turned the horses around and rode back toward Willow Creek, and the conversation shifted in the way of conversations between people who have just shared something that matters, loosened slightly easier with room for smaller things. He asked about Ruth. She told him about the way Ruth used to explain mathematics to her as children, making fractions into stories about people dividing up a pie at a party, making algebra into puzzles with characters who had to find what they were missing. She told him that Ruth would have been a magnificent teacher, and that sometimes she still thought about the students who would never have her. Ethan listened with his whole attention the way he always did, and when she finished he said, "That kind of person doesn't disappear. What she knew how to do, the way she made hard things approachable, that was in her, but it came from somewhere. It came from your mother probably, and from the particular combination of the family she was born into. That doesn't go away with one person. It shows up again. Different face, different name." Clara looked at him. "Where did that come from?" she said. "Thomas said something like it to me once," Ethan said. "About Rose. That the things she'd built, the way she'd organized the ranch, the way she'd managed the accounts, the particular culture of the place she'd established, none of that died with her. It was still running. I just had to learn to see it." He paused. "It took me a long time to believe him, but he was right." "He usually is," Clara said. "Don't tell him that," Ethan said. "He already knows, and he doesn't need the encouragement." Clara laughed. The sound of it moved through the cold air, and Ethan heard it and felt it do the same thing. It always did, that quick warm landing and lifting the bird that had started to stay a little longer each time. They made it back to the station with 20 minutes to spare. Gerald was watching from his window. He said nothing, which was Gerald's version of approval. Clara hung her coat back on the rack. She tied her apron. She went back to the schedule board. But before she did, at the door between the back office and the platform hall, Ethan said, "Denver." She turned. "You have 2 weeks," he said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to decide anything today." He held her gaze. "I'm just asking, when you decide whatever you decide, tell me first, before you tell anyone else." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I will," she said. He nodded. He left. She stood at the schedule board for a moment after not quite seeing it. Then she picked up the chalk and started updating the afternoon arrivals, because the noon train was 12 minutes out and she had work to do. The week that followed moved at two speeds simultaneously. Professionally, it was the busiest week the Willow Creek station had seen since summer. The freight volume increased as ranchers tried to move cattle before the ground became impassable, and Gerald's capacity for managing complexity was as always inversely proportional to the actual complexity he was required to manage. Clara handled 3 freight disputes, rerouted 2 misdirected shipments, and rewrote the filing system for the lost luggage cabinet in a way that would have saved Gerald approximately 400 hours of confusion over the previous decade if she'd done it in September, personally. The week moved like water under ice, invisibly, with a great deal of pressure, building underneath a surface that looked still. Margaret's reply to her latest letter arrived on Thursday. "You rode out to see the light with him," Margaret had written. Clara, "You rode out to see the light. Do you understand what that means? That's not a woman who's going to Denver." Clara read it 3 times. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She didn't write back immediately because she didn't yet know what she wanted to say. That evening in her room behind the station, she took out Denver's letter and read it again. The offer was genuine. She'd known that from the first reading. The salary was real. The position was real. The opportunity was exactly what it described itself to be. A larger station, a records department that needed the kind of careful, systematic intelligence she had. In abundance, a city with theaters and libraries, and the particular density of human life that a town like Willow Creek, for all its warmth, could not replicate. It was a good offer from a good organization. She set it down. She thought about Sunday afternoons. She thought about a man who had arrived 5 minutes early, and then 6 minutes early, and now most recently 7 minutes early, to buy a ticket. He didn't use for a train, he didn't board. She thought about the east pasture and the light coming in at an angle. She thought about what it would feel like to leave, and whether the feeling would be relief or loss, and she was honest enough with herself to know which one it was, and honest enough about what that meant to sit with it for a while before she decided what to do with it. She did not sleep particularly well. On Friday, Harlan's preliminary claim was formally dismissed by the Territorial Land Office. Benjamin Cross sent a telegram. Clara received it before Ethan did, since it came through the station line, and she held it for exactly 12 seconds before redirecting it to the proper recipient, which was long enough to read it and understand that the east pasture was fully and finally secured, and that Wesley Harlan had departed Willow Creek on the Tuesday morning train to Billings without a second ticket back. The 12 seconds were not a professional lapse. They were simply the time it took for her body to register something that her mind had already known was coming. But that felt different landed differently when it was official. She sent a runner to the ranch with the telegram. 20 minutes later, Thomas Reed rode through town at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was considerably faster than his usual deliberate canter, and he stopped outside the station and tied his horse and came through the door and stood at the window. "Well," he said. "It's done," Clara said. Thomas put both hands flat on the counter. He looked at them. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has been carrying a weight for long enough that the absence of it requires adjustment. "He's at the north pasture this morning," Thomas said. "He'll have the telegram by now. He'll be back by afternoon." He looked up. "He's going to want to thank you again." "Tell him not to," Clara said. "You can tell him yourself," Thomas said. "He won't listen to me on this, or on much of anything when it comes to you." He paused. "That's not a complaint. In 22 years, I have never once seen that man not listen to himself in the particular way he's not listening to himself right now. It's a considerable development." Clara smiled despite herself. "You're pleased." "I am extremely not saying anything one way or the other," Thomas said with the dignity of a man who is saying something one way or the other very clearly. He straightened up from the counter. "You got that Denver letter yet?" Clara stared at him. "You corresponded with Margaret," she said. "I may have mentioned in passing that circumstances were developing," Thomas said carefully. Thomas. Margaret is a sensible woman who had relevant concerns. Thomas. He stopped. You are, Clara said with great feeling, the single most indirect man I have ever met in my life. Thomas Reed looked at her for a moment. Then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a genuine, unguarded smile, brief as a match strike but real. You haven't met Ethan yet, he said. When he's trying. He left before she could respond. Clara stood at her window and looked at the door for a moment. Then she started to laugh. Really laugh the way she'd laughed when Ethan told her about the pots and the horses, surprised and unguarded, and grateful for the people who had, without her entirely noticing, become part of the texture of her days. She went back to her ledger. She was still smiling when the noon train came in. Ethan arrived at the station at 3 o'clock. Not Sunday, not his usual time. Friday at 3, which meant he'd ridden in from the north pasture specifically directly without going home first, which was evident from the fact that he was still in his working coat, and his boots had the particular quality of boots that had been in a pasture recently. He came to the window. Clara looked at him. I know, she said. The telegram. The telegram, he said. And also, he stopped. He put both hands on the counter the way Thomas had, and she thought, watching him, that the two men had been together long enough that they'd acquired each other's gestures without knowing it. I rode out to the north pasture this morning to check the storm damage. I've been avoiding the assessment because the numbers were going to be bad, and I knew it. How bad? Clara asked. Bad enough. He looked at his hands. 3 shelters need rebuilding before the next hard freeze. The feed stores are lower than I want them. It's going to be a difficult winter. He looked up. I can manage it. It's not the kind of difficulty that threatens the operation. But it's real, and it's going to require... He paused. It's going to require me to ask some people for help, which I've decided to do, which is a decision I'm telling you about because you'll appreciate that it represents a significant personal development. Clara kept her expression level. A significant personal development. According to Thomas, yet. According to Rose, it would qualify as a minor miracle. He almost smiled. I called in some favors from neighboring ranchers this morning. Asked Hector Vega, 2 properties east, if he had spare feed to sell at a fair price. Asked Jim and Carl Sawyer if they could spare 2 men for a week to help rebuild the shelters. And Hector said yes immediately and told me the price was the same as it was 3 years ago, which is below current market. Jim Sawyer said he'd come himself. Ethan shook his head slightly. I've been alone on this ranch for 7 years, and apparently the moment I asked for help, 15 years of neighboring came back in about 40 minutes. People were waiting to be asked, Clara said. Apparently. He looked at her. You told me that once. Different words. The same thing. You heard it better the second time, Clara said. I hear most things better the second time, he said. It's one of my less admirable qualities. Thomas agrees, Clara said. Thomas talks too much, Ethan said with the fondness of a man who does not mean a word of it. Clara leaned on the counter slightly. Ethan, the claim is dismissed. The east pasture is yours. Harlan is gone. The winter will be hard, but you've got neighbors, and you've got Thomas, and the operation is sound. She looked at him steadily. How does that feel? He thought about it honestly the way he did everything. It feels, he said slowly, like the last 7 years I've been in a room with the door closed. And lately the door's been opening, inch by inch. He looked at her. You're most of the reason for that. Clara said nothing. I'm not putting that on you, he said quickly. I'm not saying it as a way of asking you to stay or creating an obligation. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I've decided to be honest about true things when I know them, which is also a significant personal development. He paused. I'm full of those lately. You are, Clara agreed. Denver, he said. Her heart did the thing again. The unauthorized thing. Denver, she said. You have a week left, he said. I know that. I'm still not asking you to decide anything today. He held her gaze with the direct, unguarded look that had become her favorite of his expressions. But I want to tell you something. Not as a reason, just as a true thing. Tell me, she said. Last Sunday, riding back from the east pasture. I was thinking about what Rose used to say about recognizing a good thing. He stopped, started again more carefully. She used to say that the mistake people made was waiting until they were certain. That certainty was a destination, not a starting point. That you started moving toward something because it felt true, not because you could prove it. Clara waited. This feels true, Ethan said. I don't know what it is yet. I don't know what you want it to be. I don't know what you're going to decide about Denver, and I mean it when I say that whatever you decide, I'll respect it completely. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. But I wanted you to know that it feels true, whatever it is. The station was quiet around them. Gerald was in the back office. The afternoon train was 2 hours out. The clock on the wall ticked with its usual indifference to the weight of human moments. Clara looked at the man in front of her. The man who had spent 7 years on a bench, being faithful to a grief so deep, it had become its own kind of shelter, who had walked off the platform without looking back, who had ridden east to reclaim a view his wife had loved, who had picked up the phone, the telegram wire, and asked his neighbors for help, as though it were simply the sensible thing to do. I haven't answered Denver, she said. I know. I've been trying to figure out what I'm waiting to know before I can answer it. And... His voice was very quiet. I think I've been waiting, Clara said carefully, to know whether the thing that's keeping me here is a thing or a feeling, whether it's real or whether it's... She stopped. I came here looking for a place that didn't know what I'd lost, and instead I found a place that understood it, which is different, and better, and more complicated. More complicated, Ethan agreed. But I'm not afraid of complicated, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to run from something because it's complicated. I just need... She took a breath. I need to know that what you're describing, what feels true, that you're talking about what I think you're talking about. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Clara, he said. Yes. I put my hat on the bench beside me every Sunday for 7 years because I couldn't stand the empty space, he said. I needed something there, even if it was just a hat. He paused. Last Sunday I forgot to put it down. She understood exactly what he meant. She looked at him for a long moment, and the something that had been building for weeks, that warm, precarious, unauthorized thing, steadied inside her chest into something she could name. Not certainty. Not yet. But direction. The feeling of having found the right heading and beginning, finally, to move. I'm not going to Denver, she said. Ethan went very still. I want to be clear, she continued. I'm not going because of you. I'm not going because of me. Because I looked at that offer, and I looked at what I have here, and they're not the same kind of thing, and I know which kind matters more to me. She held his gaze. But also yes, because of you. Both things are true. The clock ticked. Both things are true, Ethan said, like a man testing the weight of something before he trusted it to hold. Both things are true, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment with that early morning sky look, and in it was everything she needed to see. The relief and the care, and the careful, enormous tenderness of a man who had learned not to take things for granted because he knew what it cost to lose them. I'd like to take you to supper, he said. On Saturday, at Hanson's, if you'd be willing. Clara blinked. After everything, the directness of it surprised her. Hanson's is the nicest restaurant in Willow Creek, she said. It is, Ethan agreed. Gerald will know by Sunday morning. The whole town will know by Saturday night, Ethan said. I've made my peace with that. Clara looked at him. She thought about the man who had bought a platform ticket every Sunday and sat alone on a bench with a folded letter and his hat in the empty space beside him. She thought about what it had cost him to walk off that platform without looking back. About what it was costing him right now to stand at a station clerk's window on a Friday afternoon and ask directly for what he wanted. She thought about Rose, who had spent 14 years teaching this man to let people in, and who had done it so well that the lesson was still working long after she was gone. Saturday, Clara said. Hanson's. Ethan nodded once. He straightened from the counter. 6 o'clock, he said. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. He walked to the door. This time, before he went through it, he stopped and turned back. He looked at her across the empty station floor with the particular look of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. He said it. "I'm glad it was raining," he said. "That Sunday. I'm glad the platform was empty and you came out anyway." Clara held his gaze. "So am I," she said. He went. The door swung closed behind him. Clara stood at her window and listened to Corporal's hooves on the packed dirt of the street, and she pressed her hand flat against the counter, the way Ethan pressed his hand against the letter, not to hold on to something, but to feel that it was real. It was real. It was entirely, completely, specifically real. She picked up her chalk. The afternoon train was an hour and 40 minutes out. There were departures to post and arrivals to update, and a lost luggage report from Tuesday that still needed filing. And Gerald was going to emerge from the back office within the next 10 minutes looking for the freight ledger. Clara Whitmore went back to work. For the first time since she'd arrived in Willow Creek, she went back to work feeling not like a woman who was managing the gap between where she was and where she was going, but like a woman who had arrived, not at an ending, at a beginning. The kind of beginning that felt from the inside exactly like coming home. Thomas Reed found out about Saturday supper before Saturday happened. This was not because Ethan told him. Ethan did not volunteer information about his interior life under ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances of a supper invitation to a woman he'd been circling for 3 months were not ordinary by any definition. He had simply come home on Friday, seen to Corporal eaten supper, and gone to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in recent memory. Thomas found out because Hector Vega's wife told the blacksmith's wife on Saturday morning, who told the woman who ran the dry goods store, who told Gerald Purcell when he came in for his weekly tobacco, and Gerald, who possessed the particular contradiction of a man who considered himself above gossip while being constitutionally incapable of not repeating it, mentioned it to Thomas when Thomas came into town for feed supplies 2 hours later. Thomas listened to Gerald's account with the stillness of a man receiving information he has been expecting and yet finds more affecting than anticipated. "Hanson's," Thomas said. 6 o'clock. Gerald confirmed with the tone of a man reporting troop movements. Thomas picked up his feed order and walked out of the store and loaded the wagon in the cold morning air and drove back toward the ranch. He was halfway home when he had to stop the wagon, not because anything was wrong with the road or the horses. He stopped because he needed a moment that was not in motion, a moment where the world held still enough for him to feel the full weight of what had just shifted. 22 years. He had worked beside Ethan Callahan for 22 years. He had watched him marry Rose McKinnon on a June afternoon when the whole valley smelled of wildflowers. He had watched him lose her on a January morning when the ground was frozen solid and the grief came in like weather, total, consuming, indifferent to what it covered. He had watched 7 years of Sunday afternoons become the shape of a life organized entirely around absence. And now Ethan Callahan was taking a woman to supper at Hanson's on a Saturday night. Thomas sat on the wagon in the road for 2 full minutes. Then he clicked his tongue at the horses and drove home. When Ethan came into the barn that afternoon, Thomas was repairing a bridle and did not look up. "You heard," Ethan said. It was not a question. "Gerald," Thomas said. "Gerald." Ethan agreed with the resignation of a man who has lived in a small town long enough to understand that privacy was a theoretical concept. Thomas set down the bridle. He looked at his oldest friend with the eyes of a man who has 60 years of experience, distinguishing between things that matter and things that don't, and who knows precisely which category this falls into. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked. Ethan considered denying it for approximately 1 second. "Yes." "Good," Thomas said. "Means you're paying attention." He picked the bridle back up. "Wear the gray coat, not the working one, the good one." "I know which coat to wear, Thomas." "The last time you dressed for an occasion was Rose's cousin's wedding in '86, Thomas said. "I have low confidence in your independent judgment on this matter." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "The gray coat," he said. "And polish the boots," Thomas said. "Both of them." Ethan walked out of the barn. Thomas waited until the footsteps faded. Then he set down the bridle again and sat very still for a moment with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance, and he said quietly and without embarrassment to nobody in the barn, but perhaps to someone beyond it, "You'd be real pleased, Rose. You'd be real pleased." Then he picked up the bridle and went back to work, because sentiment had its place, and its place was brief, and there was always more work to be done. Supper at Hanson's lasted 3 hours. This was not what either of them planned. They had planned insofar as either of them planned things to eat a meal and talk and be back at a reasonable hour, because Clara had the early shift Sunday, and Ethan had cattle to check before dawn. 3 hours was not reasonable. 3 hours was what happened when two people who had been carefully rationing their time together in 90-minute increments on Sunday afternoons discovered what it felt like to have an entire evening. They talked about everything. Clara told him about Ohio, not the grief of it, which he already knew, but the before her mother's kitchen and the way it smelled on bread baking days. Her father, who had died when she was 12, and who she still measured men against in the particular way of women who lost their fathers. Young, the schoolyard, where she and Ruth had developed an elaborate system of coded signals to communicate across the distance between the younger and older classes that they'd used all the way through to Ruth's graduation. Ethan told her about his parents. His father, a Montana rancher who had built the original Callahan homestead with 4 other men and a considerable amount of stubbornness, and his mother, who had been a schoolteacher in Illinois before she married, and who had never quite let the Montana landscape convince her that culture was something that happened elsewhere. He told her about learning to ride at 4 years old on a horse, substantially too large for him, an experience his father considered character building and his mother considered grounds for a serious conversation about parenting philosophy. Clara laughed at that. Ethan watched her laugh and did not look away. He told her about meeting Rose at a county dance in 1868 when he was 21 and she was 19, and he had spent 40 minutes working up to asking her to dance, only to find when he finally did it that she'd been waiting for him to ask since he'd walked in the door, and had used the 40 minutes to decide she was going to say yes regardless of how he asked. "She told you that," Clara said. "On our 3rd anniversary," he said. "She thought it was very funny. She laughed every time she told it." "How often did she tell it?" "At least once a year," he said. "Usually at my expense in company." "She sounds like someone who knew how to love without being sentimental about it," Clara said. Ethan thought about that. "That's exactly right. She loved hard, and she laughed at the things that deserved to be laughed at, including me. Especially me." He looked at the table. "I didn't understand until she was gone how rare that combination was. To be loved seriously and not taken seriously all at once." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My mother was like that with my father," she said. "He died when I was 12 and she never remarried, but she talked about him the same way for the rest of her life. She talked about him like he was still in the room." She paused. "I used to think that was sad, that she'd organized so much of herself around someone who wasn't there anymore. Now I think I didn't understand what it meant to love someone that completely." "You understand it better now?" Ethan asked. Clara met his eyes. "I'm beginning to," she said. The candle between them had burned down to half. The restaurant around them had quieted to just 2 other occupied tables. Neither of them had noticed. Ethan reached across the table. He set his hand over hers, not grasping, not urgent, just covering. The way you set your hand over something you want to be sure is there. Clara looked at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a moment without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that the contact wasn't already saying more precisely. Then Clara said, "Ask me something. Something you've been wanting to ask and haven't." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy here?" he said. "Not content, not managing. Happy." Clara thought about it with the honesty it deserved. "Yes," she said. "In a way I haven't been in a long time. The kind of happy that isn't loud, the kind that's just present, that feels like the right shape." "The right shape," he said. "When things fit," she said. "When the life you're living is the right size for who you are. I didn't have that for a long time. I thought I had to go somewhere larger to find it." She looked at him. It turns out the size of the place is not the point. Ethan nodded slowly. Rose she used to say that home wasn't a location. That home was what happened when you stopped performing for the world and started actually living in it. He paused. I thought I understood what she meant. I think I understand it better now. Clara smiled. It was a different smile than the ones he'd catalogued on Sunday afternoons, softer, less guarded, the smile of a woman who is not managing an impression, but simply feeling something and letting it show. We should probably go, she said without moving. Probably, he agreed, also without moving. They stayed another 20 minutes. Winter hit the valley in earnest 2 weeks later. It came the way Montana winters came, not gradually, not with the courtesy of warning, but completely and immediately, as though the season had been waiting just beyond the ridge and had decided on a Tuesday morning that it had been patient long enough. Ethan's North Pasture shelters, rebuilt with Hector Vega's crew and the Sawyer brothers, and a week of the kind of neighboring that small communities do when they remember they are communities held through the first hard freeze. The feed stores, supplemented by Hector's supply at the below-market price, were sufficient. The cattle were moved, and the operation was sound, and the winter, though hard, was the kind of hard that was manageable, rather than the kind that broke things. Ethan worked from before dawn until after dark most days. Clara worked her station hours and spent her evenings, the ones she wasn't spending at the ranch, which became more frequent without either of them formally deciding that they would, writing to Margaret, occasionally corresponding with Benjamin Cross on the details of the land claim dismissal. Because Cross had said he wanted her thoughts on an aspect of the territorial record system that he was incorporating into another case. Cross had also, in his last letter, mentioned that if she was ever considering a change in professional direction, the records work she'd done on the Callahan case would constitute an exceptionally strong basis for a position in territorial law administration. Clara had written back thanking him and filed the letter in her satchel with the same careful deliberateness with which she filed everything, not discarded, not acted upon, simply held in the place where future options lived. She told Ethan about it on a Sunday afternoon in December, sitting on the bench that had become theirs in a way that the town had accepted, with the equanimity of people who had watched the whole thing develop at a pace they could follow. Cross offered you a position, Ethan said. He mentioned a possibility, Clara said. For someday. Not immediately. I was quiet for a moment. Not the tight quiet of a man receiving unwanted information, the considered quiet of a man who has learned to think before he responds to things that matter. What do you want to do? He said. I don't know yet, Clara said honestly. I know I'm not leaving Willow Creek. I know whatever I do next will be from here, not from somewhere else. She looked at him. Is that all right to say? That's more than all right to say, Ethan said. I just want you to know that my decisions are my decisions, she said. I'm not asking permission. I'm not deferring. I want you to know what I'm thinking. He looked at her with a great steadiness. I don't want you to defer to me. I want you to tell me what you think and what you want and what you're planning, and I want to tell you the same, and I want us to figure out how those things fit together. He paused. That's what I wanted with Rose. That's what we had. Two people who each had a complete life and chose to make one life out of it instead. He held her gaze. Not one person disappearing into the other person's shape. Clara was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this, she said. I've been thinking about very little else, he said. The train arrived. The steam rose around them in the December cold, thick and white, and Clara watched it the way she always watched it now. Not as a departure, but as a marker, the weekly punctuation of something ongoing. The train came and went, and the platform resettled into quiet. Ethan, Clara said. Yes, the letter, the one you carry. She said it carefully, the way you say something you've been holding for a while. You still carry it. He reached into his coat. He looked at it for a moment, the folded paper worn soft at the creases that had traveled every Sunday for 7 years in the inside pocket of his coat. Yes, he said. Is that, do you want to keep carrying it? He turned the letter over in his hands. It's the last letter she wrote me, he said. She wrote it from her father's house, 3 days before she died. He was quiet. She wrote about small things, the way the light looked that morning, her father's improvement, a recipe she'd gotten from a neighbor that she wanted to try when she got home. His voice had the particular quality it always got when he spoke of Rose, not broken, not raw, but weighted with a love that had had 7 years to settle into something permanent. She didn't know it was the last one. She was just writing a letter. The way you write when you expect to see the person soon, and the letter is just a way of being in touch until you do. "What does it say at the end?" Clara asked gently. Ethan opened it. He had not opened it in front of anyone before. Clara understood this without being told, the way she understood most things about him, by paying attention. He read the last lines aloud. His voice was steady. "I can see you already standing at your usual spot on the platform. You'll be there before the train stops, just like always. Just like always, I'll look for you first. Save my spot on the bench. I'll be home Sunday. All my love, always, Rose." The silence after those words was absolute. Clara did not try to fill it. She sat in it with him the way she'd sat in the rain on that first November Sunday, because some silences were not empty and did not require filling. After a long moment, Ethan folded the letter back along its creases. "I'm going to keep carrying it," he said. "Not because I'm waiting, not because I can't let go." He looked at Clara directly. "Because she was real, because what we had was real. And carrying it isn't holding me back from anything. It's part of who I am. It's one of the things I'm made of." "I know," Clara said. "I wouldn't ask you to put it down." "I know you wouldn't," he said. "That's why I can tell you." He put the letter back in his coat. Then he said, "Clara, I want to ask you something." She waited. "Not today," he said. "Not right this moment, but soon. There's something I want to ask you, and I wanted to tell you that I'm going to ask it so it doesn't come at you sideways." Clara looked at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They sat on the bench together in the December cold. Two people who had arrived at the same place from directions neither of them had chosen, and the tracks ahead were empty, and the platform was still, and the town of Willow Creek went about its Saturday business all around them, completely ordinary, completely unchanged. Only everything was different. He asked her on a Sunday in January. The anniversary Sunday, though, he hadn't planned it that way. He genuinely had not realized until he rode into town and the date settled on him, somewhere along the main street, that it was 7 years to the week since Rose had died. 7 years since the telegram had come. 7 years since Thomas had stood in the yard with a piece of paper in his hand and a look on his face that had told Ethan everything before he even reached him. He sat on the bench. Clara came out with the coffee. She sat beside him no longer at the respectful distance of those first November Sundays, but close the way people sit when they have earned the right to the proximity. 7 years, he said. She understood immediately. "Yes, I rode in thinking about what this day has been for 7 years, he said. What it felt like to come here every week and sit in this spot and feel the absence of her like a physical thing. He looked at his hands. "And I sat down today, and the first thing I felt was, I wanted to tell you something. I wanted to tell you that she's the reason I'm here. Not just today. She's the reason I know how to love someone the way I want to love you. She taught me. She spent 14 years teaching me what it looked like to be present with someone, to honor them, to let them matter fully." He looked at Clara. "I don't want to love you instead of her. I want to love you because of what she gave me. Because she left me better than she found me, and it would be a waste of that not to use it." Clara's eyes were bright. She didn't look away. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said quietly. He reached into his coat. Not for the letter. He reached past the letter and came out with something smaller. A ring, simple gold, with a small inset stone that caught the winter light. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when I married Rose, and told me it was for safekeeping, and then she winked at me, which meant she knew something I didn't. Rose never wore it. She said it was for the next woman I loved." He held it. "She said that to me, Clara. 3 months before she died, when she knew she was getting worse, she told me it was for the next woman. I told her there wasn't going to be a next woman, and she told me not to be dramatic." He looked up. She was right. She was so rarely wrong about anything important. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Ethan," she said. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know we haven't. I know there are conversations we haven't had yet, and I'm not asking you to decide anything today that you're not ready for. I need you to know what I'm asking. When you're ready, whenever that is." He held her gaze with everything he had, all of it unmanaged and unguarded. "Will you stay? Not just in Willow Creek. With me. Will you choose this life with all of it, the hard winters and the ranch and Thomas, who is going to be insufferable about this? Will you build something here with me?" Clara looked at the ring for a long moment. She thought about the rain that first Sunday. The question she'd asked that nobody else had thought to ask. The letter pressed flat against his knee. The way he'd said her name, Rose, for the first time in 7 years, into a stranger's ear, on a platform in the middle of a Montana storm. She thought about Ruth, and the way she found the right angle to show you a thing. She thought about her mother setting the table for 3. She thought about Margaret writing, "That's not a woman who's going to Denver," and being more right than she knew. She thought about the east pasture and the light coming in. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere expecting one thing and find something else entirely. She held out her hand. "Yes," she said. "All of it. Yes." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger. He held her hand with both of his, for a moment, not speaking. Clara felt the warmth of that hold move through her, like something she hadn't known she was cold without. The westbound train appeared at the far edge of the valley. They watched it come in together, not with grief, not with waiting, but with the simple presence of 2 people who have found the place they intend to be and are no longer looking for exits. The train arrived. The steam rose. The platform shook gently. Ethan did not watch the tracks when it left. He was looking at Clara. They were married in April, when the valley was soft, and the east pasture was green again, and the light came in at the angle Rose had loved, which was the angle they chose for the ceremony. Small outside, with Thomas Reed standing up for Ethan, and Margaret arrived from Billings, standing up for Clara and Hector Vega and his wife and the Sawyer brothers, and half of Willow Creek arranged on the hillside, because nobody had told them not to come, and several people had told them they were welcome. And the result was, as Thomas noted afterward, considerably more people than planned, and exactly the right amount. Thomas did not cry. He stood through the whole thing with his arms folded and his jaw set and his eyes very bright, and anyone who said otherwise was a liar, and he told them so. And then he shook Ethan's hand with both of his in a grip that lasted longer than handshakes usually lasted, and said nothing, which was the only language sufficient to the occasion. Clara planted a garden that spring on the south side of the ranch house. She planted it deliberately, thoughtfully, the way she did everything with attention to what would last. Ethan repaired the fence along Rose's favorite riding path on the east pasture. He did it on a Saturday morning alone, and when he was done, he stood at the fence for a moment and put his hand on one of the posts and said quietly into the spring air, "You were right about the ring. You were right about all of it. Thank you." The wind moved through the grass of the east pasture, which was green and enormous and entirely his. He walked home. Clara was in the kitchen when he came through the door, and she looked up from whatever she was doing and looked at him. The straight, complete look of a woman who was present fully and without reservation in the life she had chosen. And he stopped for a moment in the doorway, just to have that look land on him. "Well," she said. "Fixed," he said. "Come eat," she said. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. On the table beside the bread and the coffee pot and the 2 plates Clara had set was the old folded letter. She had taken to setting it there on mornings when she sensed he might be thinking of Rose, not as a memorial, not as a reminder of loss, but as what it was, a part of him set at the table with the rest of the things that belonged there. He sat down. He touched the letter once briefly with 2 fingers. A greeting. A recognition, the gesture a man acknowledging something beloved. Then he poured the coffee, and he looked at his wife across the table, and he was present completely and without reservation in the life he had finally allowed himself to choose. Years later, people in Willow Creek would still tell the story of the cowboy who waited at the dusty train station every Sunday for 7 years. They told it in different ways depending on who was telling it. Some said he was faithful. Some said he was lost. Some said he was the saddest man they'd ever seen sitting still. What they all agreed on eventually was this: he had been waiting. Just not for what they thought. He had been waiting for the moment when grief would stop being a wall and start being a door. He had been waiting without knowing it for someone patient enough and honest enough to ask the one question that opened it. One rainy Sunday. One empty platform. One woman who sat down without being asked and said quietly without flinching, "Who are you waiting for?" That was where it started. And it never stopped. Not with the ring, not with the garden, not with the fence, repaired along the riding path, not with the years that came after one Sunday at a time. The bench always occupied, now the space beside it, never empty. Ethan Callahan had spent 7 years waiting for something that couldn't come back. What came instead was better than waiting. What came instead was a woman who understood that love was not a replacement for what you'd lost. It was what you built from what the losing had made you. And on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the town of Willow Creek, Montana, at the same dusty train station where it all began, the cowboy who once sat alone finally had somewhere to be. He was already there. He had been there all along. He just needed someone to show